everybody, welcome back. I'm on my way to Utah to show you a behind-the-scenes tour of the bottling and mixing facility to show you how involved it is to make the world's best herbal products. As you remember, back in December of 2018, my original company threw their arms up the air and says, we can't handle this anymore. It's too much paperwork, it's too expensive, it's not financially worth it, too many hoops and regulations. It was just so much work. And this I'm going to show you today, and you'll understand why they did that and why it's not as easy as it seems. You don't just buy some cheap herbs and mix them and bottle them and sell them. To make the world's best, it requires a lot. So I'm taking you to Utah today to give you a behind-the-scenes tour of everything that's involved to make this. And I hope you'll understand even more what I've been telling you all along. This is not a simple, easy, cheap process. So come with me to Utah and I'll show you right now what it takes to make the world's best herbal products.
I've been doing this process since the 80s. I've sourced from just about every country in the world. And when Markus came along, we've discovered, I think, probably an additional 20 or 30 new ingredients, new sources. So it's been great as he's searched for various ingredients that are gonna supply some unique ingredients for health and various things. We've gone all over the world and have found things that have been available in certain cultures for a lot of years. So there's been a lot of research with a lot of these ingredients that are being used. And it's been unique as we have done our due diligence to find our sources to match what he's formulated. It's been an eye-opening experience. There's some unique uses of fruits, like say for instance, even just simple things like orange peel and pith that's in some of the ingredients. That's not a standard ingredient, but a lot of people know that there's a lot of health benefit from those ingredients. And so he's either sourced some unique ingredients and products like that, or just products like the gabinge, which is the kakadu plum, which is a highly high in vitamin C and other products. So there's been some unique stuff with this that we've have enjoyed as we've been bringing these products online. Some of these products that we've sourced out, like for instance the pine needle that's in the greens products, these are hand-picked, hand-sourced. We dry those and grind them and test them in-house and then test them with a third-party lab. So there are some unique countries in South America that some of these things that are wildcrafted are grown in certain climates that aren't just farmed, like say in the Andes and some of those. There's ingredients that are grown in high mountain places that are wildcrafted, and because of that, individuals are hand-picking these, bringing them down to where they're further processed, whether that's drying, grinding, etc. And so there's a lot of handcrafted and wildcrafted products just because of the unique environments where they grow. And the cultivation and the harvesting isn't accessible to some of the modern equipment that we're used to. So there's some unique processes there. So these are products here will get received and checked in, and what the individuals will do, they'll actually draw a sample from every raw ingredient that we receive. And so we'll receive that. That's part of this receiving process. They'll also make sure that the counts and everything are correct for quality, that we got the right product and the right style. They'll also take a sample and send it over to quality, and that's where we'll check that also. They'll also, from here, take the C of A's that arrive with the product and do a verification over in the quality lab. The C of A is the certificate of analysis, and with that, if it doesn't have, we have a list that they've got to read, and I'll show us over there in the quality room. They've got to verify what is on the C of A. If something's missing, then we'll send it out for third-party testing for that particular missing item. And there are a few items that we mandate that we want to have there on those. And some of those would be like the total plate count, E. coli, staph, and salmonella. If those aren't on the customer C of A's or a few other things, then we'll send it out and it'll stay in quarantine here in this area. Here, the way these, if you want to look down here, these are just the shells for individual products, and we pull from the organics alphabetized over here. And some of these, there's multiple versions of different ingredients. Somebody will get a batch record. With batching, the FDA requires 2 people to batch, and they're doing 2 things. One, they're verifying the weight or the measure, and we do everything by weight. They're weighing out the ingredients and making sure those are the right weight according to the ingredient list. They're also making sure that that ingredient went into the batch. And that's all part of the FDA requirement, that those 2 people do those 2 things. We don't want stuff sitting on a shelf for too long so that it becomes obsolete or expired. What I'm going to do is get a So this in our blender, you can just kind of see it's a stainless steel blender. 2 barrels of free colon caps that makes up this lot number. It's already been verified by a supervisor, the weight, that it's been batched. It's then been screened and then it's been blended together. So this free colon caps is then ready to go into one of those machines and become capsules. We also sometimes have to regulate the moisture in the air, especially with powder fill and whatnot. So we've got dehumidifiers throughout the plant. These individual units also pull moisture out of the air and bring back in cool air. So they're helping do a 2-fold process. They're dehumidifying and cooling. They're done with that run. So he's taken the part that was the hopper for the powder filler and getting ready to clean that. This individual, he's doing a quality check right now of the weight. So about every 15 minutes, because they're so low, we'll do a sampling and log that into our logbook here of how many 10 capsules and what the weights are. And then he'll make adjustments as needed. At the same time it's being made, it's being polished. And then from there, we took it over there to them to hand sort. This is another machine that's running some trim force. He's just doing a quality check to make sure the machine is set up correctly. And so with that, part of it is doing an actual count. And then we also do a count about every 10-15 minutes. We'll pull a random one, and quality will do a check, and also the operators down line will do a check to make sure the capsule counts are correct. This group of people right now is doing a hand sorting of the capsules. With that, after the process of the capsules being polished to remove any dust, they're then hand sorted. What they're looking for is ones that were damaged in the manufacturing or even filling out of the capsulation machine. Then they also are doing a sorting to make sure the level of powder is complete, because occasionally the machine might underfill 1 or 2. And so they're doing a visual check of that process. And this process, this gives an extra level of protection. It'll actually, that seal is there, and then there's a second seal inside the lid. There's a seal. So once the shrink band is removed and the lid's removed, there's a seal inside. So there's that double layer of protection as it goes down the line for contamination. We've had some customers that will ask why there's the holes in the liners as they open up their lid and see the protective liner with a hole. Here's an inside shot of that same a type of lid that'll give us a good visual of that. These holes are in there for the purpose of allowing the pressure of the bottle to avoid implosion as they go to higher elevations. There's usually a consistent pattern with those. And so with that, you'll see these are in a line. Sometimes the smaller lids might be a 4 square. These are not liners that have been tampered with. Those are actually purposefully put in there, and there's not an actual way to get like a pin the size of that hole. It's fairly microscopic, and that's not what those holes are for. They're just to allow pressure to release from the bottle. Now, as far as tampering, even that hole is filled in. It's designed that way, and those, like I say, are simply for the elevation change that the bottle might incur as it travels to different parts of the country or different parts of the world in different elevations. Some of the concern that people have is maybe somebody injected and tampered with the inside of the product with, say, a needle or something. But normally that would happen with one hole, not in a perfect uniform pattern as you see here, or sometimes there's a perfect square pattern, a pattern of 4. And if somebody was going to adulterate or tamper with the inside of a product, they're not going to make a nice pattern like that. So don't be alarmed. This will seal the lid, and then it'll actually go through our labeling machine, and then from that it'll get a shrink band on it, and it'll come out right here. So our lines are adjustable according to the what the machinery and the finished product is. So everything's different. You've got products that are in bags, we've got them in bottles and jars, and so everything needs to be custom done according to what the needs of that product are. This process here, they're doing 100% check of every bag weight. And a lot of your stuff is small batches, and so with that, that's why we have the opportunity to actually check weigh every bag. I mean, we actually stick everyone on a scale, and that scale is calibrated by a quality person every hour. So these are actually green formula. These have actually been mocked up and ready to ship out, and then delivered over to the distribution center. Here's another one, Green Pro C. So each of these is separated into their own quality counts, so that the counts are accurate, and then they're shipped. So they're separated, and these are ready to ship. So let's go through some of these products. So these products here are all raw ingredients. So when the quality team receives products, they'll send a sample of every product that comes in, and those are right here would be the actual samples. So I'm just going to pull something here like chia seed. So every receipt of every product has all the data that's from that customer. So see, here's chamomile powder. We do an actual sample test of this against a standard. Okay, and so that standard is here in another file. And so that is one of these. There would be a sample that they compare the two to. They could also do FTIR samples to make sure, and this is different than that one, but we'll do an actual side-by-side comparison. We'll do organic testing. If we need to, we use microscopes. We require certain things from our vendors. We have certain specs. All those specs are written down here. These books are all data from our suppliers. And with that, it tells us what some of the raw ingredient specs are. And then we also have these books here are the individual ingredients and what the specs are. We then do the same thing for finished products. So say, for example, the green formula, we have a sample that's been approved. So when we finish a batch of green formula, we have a sheet that we fill out, and there's certain criteria. With any botanical, you're going to have those seasonal changes, and just from batch to batch. You know, even like say an orange, sometimes you get a sweet orange, sometimes it's a little more tangy, than the sweetness. And some of those flavors are just naturally occurring with botanicals if you don't process them out. Say, for example, if you don't extract them. With extracts, you're making a consistent product. With a lot of these products that we put in these, they're just whole powders that are just naturally occurring. And so the botanical change is going to be dependent upon season, time of harvest. We have all these, the various check sheets. We start off with a work order, what's goes into the product. This here is all the equipment, so we can see what equipment the process went through. This is what would be called a batch production record. In that, it gives us the history of the batch sheet. There's always two batch sheets. One is a batcher, and the other is a batch verifier. Those two people work together to create the batch. And then we also have a history of the suppliers and the lot number that was used. If there's ever a question, we can go back to that. We also keep records of every C of A on file of these ingredients. The FDA will, when they come through, they'll check and make sure that we have things like this in place. And a lot of the batch production record is an FDA requirement, and they spell out how to make a batch sheet and what's required to be in it. And so a lot of these things, like this screening sheet, these checks, all the way down to what we call like the documentation of the capsules. Here's a supervisor and some checks that they did as they were monitoring the line as this was being made. And then here's a quality control individual's check sheet. So not only does a supervisor do a check, a quality personnel goes through and does a check. When we receive a product, all the testing that we did, we keep those in a file. And the FDA will come in and monitor those records, which is the C of A's, and then the checks that we as a facility have done to validate those tests. When we send them out to a third-party lab, we might be checking things like the protein content, or we might be checking the polyphenols, or we might be checking vitamin C levels of a product just to validate the potency. Anything that was left over from the April order will be used up. If there was any, like say a kilo left, it'll be used up in the July order. And so in that case, there's only about 2 months, depending on how long we order. And most of these things have a shelf life raw ingredient from anywhere from 2, generally 3 is the standard, up to 5 years or more, depending on the product. So even though these things have generally a 2-year shelf life, we're only sitting on stuff for about 2 or 3 months at most, because it's going to get used up the next time an order's placed. And most of the products in the Markus products are that being rotated through in that kind of time frame. I've seen product myself that I've tasted and sent to labs that's 10 years old. That, you know, if it just hasn't been used because it's obsolete, and I'm using it personally, I've had like some of the greens, some of the things that don't break down, like things with a vitamin as the active ingredient, aren't going to break down. You know, a lot of the minerals aren't going to break down. Heavy metal testing, we do random testing with that. We do what's called skip lot testing with most of our products. So we validate our customer C of A's through skip lot testing. With that, we'll check for any active ingredients. We'll validate the C of A that came in's microbiology testing is accurate to our third-party lab, and then at the same time we'll do tests for identity and heavy metals. The standard heavy metals that people are concerned with are the four, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury are the standard 4 in most products. If a product has a unique historic heavy metal that's different than those, we will test for those also. But those are the 4 standard that most people will check for. that fall under the Prop 65. We also have what the color should look like. If it's a good in-season product, should it be bright red, or should something be green or kind of light green? Should it be a deep dark green, say for a cereal grass? And so all that information is on these spec sheets for our incoming checks. So the green formula that we've sent out, here are the different lots that we've made and compared to the library sample. So these have all been tested and released for taste, color, the texture and everything. 2 samples of every lot we ever make is kept and stored next door, and those are stored in conditions of what we recommend, which is in a cool, dry, semi-dark place out of sunlight. And so those are stored for up to 2 years or longer. The FDA requires 2 years minimum. And some other specs. One of them that we follow is the 2 years, and we actually keep some of those for up to 3 years. Whenever we can, we try not to source from China. There's too many sources. There has been historically with China sourcing some concerns of their heavy metals and what's allowed. There's also been concern with their the ground being fertilized with human waste and whatnot. So with modern testing, we can see if there is something that has somehow been affiliated with China processing, whether it's growing or the drying process. All we've got to do is do our testing. But whenever we can, if we can avoid, just for the costs, to avoid the China and all the the time that it's going to sit transferring over here, we try to make things as fresh as possible. So whenever we can get something that's sourced here in America, that's optimum for us, just with the time frame of from farm to customer. So the consumer is going to get it quicker if it's grown and made here on this continent, whether it's South America or Canada and the US. Or even Europe. We have sometimes the time to get it over, whether it's flown over or shipped over. But whenever we can source something and avoid China as a source, we do. Oftentimes, customers have concerns about different things that they've read online. There's so much information online, and it's a wonderful resource, but also you got to be careful. Some of those things that people have put on there are to discredit either a competitor of theirs or a particular product. And so we get questions oftentimes relating to a certain form of a certain ingredient that might be in a product that somebody's usually read online. Do your research. Don't just Google something and go to the top one and figure that that's gospel. Do your research. Markus, as he's designed these things, has tried to utilize the best sources and best forms of ingredients that have been made into these products. As these have been formulated, he's taken a lot of those into account. What's the best form, or the form that is going to be the best bioavailability and efficacy in its finished product. Every product is released off of a criteria sheet, and that is in what's called the master manufacturing record. And I've got a master manufacturing record for every product. This is from the state of Utah. It's our Good Manufacturing Practice Certificate, also known as CGMPs. These are just various, we're registered with the state. This one is saying we're registered with the state. Here's the FDA registration and their approval. So just a few of the certifications that were registered, licensed, and licensed to do business in those capacities.
Well, I hope that helped. I hope it was interesting. I try to show you different things, bits and parts of my life. Stay tuned for the next video. Be healthy in the meantime.